Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Visible Cloaks called Reassemblage. This will likely be one of the stranger reviews that I've done in some time. Now, granted, I could say that about the majority of electronic music that I cover, especially in the more experimental and quirky that it gets. But Visible Cloaks sits at a peculiar space all on its own, to the point where I'm not quite sure how to properly describe it. The project of composers Spencer Dolan and Ryan Carlisle, the sound sits at an odd, plucky brand of warbling ambience that sparks and careens off all sorts of bells and whistles that played fast and loose with any ideas of consistent key or tempo or groove. Now, that's certainly what I felt about their self-titled debut project, which, as expected, had a certain homegrown Bandcamp quality in its meandering experimentation, but also brought a level of quality and poise in the compositions that, really did draw a lot of my interest. And when their sophomore project began picking up considerable critical acclaim, well, suffice to say, my interest was indeed piqued. So, what did we find with Reassemblage? Well, folks, this is the sort of project where my conventional structure of reviews kind of fails me and goes out the window. And not just because there's no real lyrics for me to discuss. No, what Reassemblage reminds me much more of is an extended mood piece, aiming to cultivate a very specific tone and atmosphere more than anything else. More texture than defining melody to these tunes. And I'm not going to say that I outright dislike the tones that they're looking to create, but to me it very much feels like I'm watching a particularly obscure and slow-paced anime with no subtitles. Besides the very prominent Asian influences and what melodic song structures that we do get, and a few snippets of Japanese, this is very much reminiscent of the pseudo-alien fusion of organic fragments with gentle fizzing, plainly synthetic tones, where flesh and organic matter blends with glass, plastic, and razor-thin fragments of steel, yet without losing any of its pliability or jittery organic life. And yet, even that, it doesn't quite feel like an adequate description for any of this, nor will it provide any actual insight to whether or not I like this project. So let's start off with some of the production and instrumentation, if I can. And here's the thing, for the blend of burbling electronic fragments that comprise the majority of the tones on this album, the last word that you would think to be appropriate here would be lush or full. You'd be well within your rights to think that such skittering fragments would stand alone in the mix, or that the tones would be too tinny to mix all that well. But you know what? Maybe it's the commitment to analog recording of these synth tones, or the skill in blending a lot of these pieces, but there is a certain wild tranquility that comes to these tones that feels incredibly naturalistic. Maybe it's the balance of deeper, fuller tones in the background for the melodic fragments to touch against, but not sink within any sort of reverb. Maybe it's the command of mixed depth that allows all the pieces to play across the space. Maybe it's how, despite that depth, the mix never quite stops feeling tactile and very intimate in the way of the misty chill of an overgrown jungle late at night. But it really does create a pretty impressive soundscape in which all these tones flow and skitter and shift. Now, the duo described the approach to creating the sound as taking the synthetic sample blends of obscure world instruments and through gentle harmonic layering, assembling a tonal harmony that might have been lost at some point in time, reassembling them all into a distinct piece all on its own, something new, united from around the world and its very mechanical but fleshy elements. And yet it's a question of what that distinct as a whole actually aims to do, what it actually is with all these pieces, that I find kind of frustrating. And I know exactly what that sounds like as someone who just doesn't get this sort of ritualistic tranquility, and I just need to relax and let it all soak in. But for as good of a job as this record does in creating a lot of the atmosphere, there is still a part of me that wishes it had a better pace or had a little bit more flow. Take, for instance, for as much as the opening track screen with its glittering cascades of fizzy fragments that open up into a bigger, deeper, ethereal synth backdrop that will fill up many of the following songs, that penetration of screens doesn't seem to resolve itself into consistent crescendos or even a sense of good transitions. What instead we get are moments where the textures overlap and touch each other, but often without a sense of build or flow. Yeah, sure, it's more naturalistic, but it doesn't exactly lend to a lot of progression between songs. Rather, more moments that sit next to each other in the negative space or in the ethereal backdrop, isolated moments that might abruptly clash with the next melodic fragment. And it's not just between songs either, where the flow barely exists exist at all, let me stress this. Tracks like Terrazzo with the sharp woodwind transitions, the quivering spikes and rattles of Bloodstream with the abrupt deeper shift midway through, the plucky back half of Mimesis that doesn't really fit together, or the shift to xylophone tones on place against the tinny horn-like fragments and admittedly pretty mournful strings that I liked. And hell, sometimes there are cases that I'm just not all that fond of, or like some tones that are used that I just didn't really like the xylophone progression that blurs against the muted warbles of synth against the ethereal shifts of Mask, or the stiffened needles of synth that we get on Mimesis trying to play off the piano that's sitting kind of awkwardly out of place midway back in the mix, at least until it builds to a bit more of a groove with rounded glossy edges that, yes, eventually goes away, or the low yodeling chiptune gurgles from Matt Carlson that fill up Neume. At least a piece like Skyscraper feels sharply defined within the fizzy synth, but that song can't even last 40 seconds, it's barely even an interlude. Now I will say there are a few isolated pieces that I do like. The fizzy cascades of Wintergreen with the sandy, glassy flutters that it's pretty in the same way that a snow-covered, wind-touched forest is that's all silent, and the gradual assembly of choppy string fragments against female backing vocals on Circle. It at least felt like there was a progressive growth and evolution within the song's composition there. But overall, look, this was not a typical Patreon request. I specifically put this on my schedule and voted up. I wanted to cover this record in depth. And yet, despite all this, I feel a little bit mixed on it, honestly a little lost. I wouldn't place it among the electronic projects that I love, but it's so defiantly unique and weird in its tonal blend and balance that it almost reminds me of walking through a museum of sound, where each display is partially filled up with artifacts painstakingly rebuilt to capture that scene, that moment in time. But wandering through this museum means pace and progression is kind of fragmented. More a feature than a flaw, sure, but it also doesn't really click with me as well as I'd like. In other words, I think we have another project that I appreciate more than I outright love. But I will say there are some gorgeous moments of composition that did really suck me in, enough to knock this up to an extremely light 7 out of 10. If you're a fan of the weirder side and the more experimental side of electronic music, definitely check this out. But otherwise, well, if you want to hear something that is unlike anything else you'll probably hear in 2017, this is definitely worth the attention. Check it out, it's pretty cool. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. I'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. The link to actually get this is in the description down here below. If you guys actually have heard this, and I doubt majority of you have, but the poll's up there, I'd like to hear what you think, especially people who are more familiar with electronic or ambient music. Still not quite my forte. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears for that. And if you guys want to get more involved in my scheduling, the link to my Patreon is right there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote, and once a week you guys in the higher Patreon tiers get to add even records or movies to my schedule. More details are right there, but until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.